Welcome to Why Do We Do That, a psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with Liesel Sharabi to discuss online dating. Liesel is an associate professor in the Hugh Downs School of Human Communication and director of the Relationships and Technology Lab at Arizona State University. Her research broadly focuses on the ways communication technologies are used to develop and dissolve interpersonal relationships. And most of her work deals with how people meet, date, and fall in love on online dating sites and mobile dating apps. Her work has appeared in a variety of edited volumes and peer-reviewed journals, as well as in media outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, the Boston Globe, Time Magazine, Wired, and the BBC. She's also spoken about dating apps on radio programs and podcasts like Wireframe, NPR Marketplace, the Wall Street Journal Tech News Briefing, and the Harvard Data Science Review. Finally, you can read about her research in her Psychology Today blog entitled Dating in the Digital Age. Liesel and I touched on a wide variety of topics related to online dating. One takeaway I had was that it can be very helpful to learn about how different dating apps work before diving in and searching for a partner. Just like any web-based service, online dating apps want to connect you with people that are good matches, but at the same time, they also want you to use their product as much as possible. Knowing some of their tactics can help you be more efficient about how you navigate the platforms. We also discussed the importance of authenticity and expectations on dating apps, as well as differences in the challenges faced by men versus women. The actual day-to-day experiences on these apps can be completely different for men and women. And one of the greatest advantages you can have over the competition is to be aware of these differences. Lastly, I hope our conversation leaves you feeling empowered to try out these services if you are in fact single and interested in exploring online dating as an option. While online dating provides unique challenges that can be undesirable at times, there is a ton of value in being able to connect with thousands of people in your area and beyond with similar dating goals, as well as having the opportunity to learn a collection of details about someone before investing time and energy into building a relationship. Enjoy. Okay, I'm here with Liesel Sharabi. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me on.
So I'm very excited because today we're going to be talking about online dating, and it's a subject that's near and dear to my heart personally because I've spent the better part of the 2010s and even the past few years participating in online dating myself. So I have lots of questions for you. Liesel has done a lot of work looking at online dating and sort of the paths that people take in online dating, as well as some work looking at the algorithms. We're going to get into everything today, hopefully, if we have time. Why don't we start by just differentiating the challenges and the process of online dating versus traditional dating scenarios?
Online dating, it's really a fundamentally different experience than meeting somebody face to face, because in online dating, you're not being introduced to another person, you're being introduced to a profile. And so you have a lot of information about somebody up front before you even decide whether you would be interested in approaching them for a conversation or not. And so from there, there's lots of text-based communication back and forth that, again, is a big difference compared to how we used to meet people the old-fashioned way. And then just the algorithms and the way that these platforms sometimes intervene in the process to help you identify a partner. I mean, that's huge because now we have technology that's really acting as an intermediary, whereas before it used to be like our friends and our family, and now we're relying on computers to help us make, in some cases, the most important decision we'll ever make, which is about who we're going to spend our lives with.
Yeah, you forget that sometimes that you're served up a profile one at a time, and um, uh, some of the newer, the newer versions, your Bumbles and Hinges and Tinders, compared to the older ones, we have this swipe culture. So you're getting profiles served up. It's probably refreshing every time you close it and come back on. If you've been off it for a few days or for a week, maybe it's going to treat you differently and serve you different quality profiles. Um, let's talk about these algorithms a little bit more. Do you think that they're worth paying attention to? So certain apps will serve you up they'll say this is a compatible match, this is a compatible profile for you. My default was always that this is just an attempt to create the illusion of personalization, which is, we've handpicked this person just for you, and their goal is just making you happy, that you feel satisfied getting served up someone that's compatible. But in your view, like, is there value to these algorithms?
I think that there is definitely value in the sense that they're giving you a piece of information, just like any other piece of information you get in a profile. So your compatibility score, like it's just one data point that you could use to evaluate somebody. And I think that they can be very helpful for getting a sense of like what you might have in common with somebody, if your profiles line up, maybe even if they answered questions the way that you said you wanted somebody to. I think where the problem arises is when platforms really oversell what they're capable of. So I
Mm.
definitely don't think this should be the sole piece of information that you're using to determine compatibility with somebody, or even necessarily to eliminate somebody from your dating pool, because at the end of the day, we don't really know how these algorithms work. They are essentially black boxes, they're proprietary. And so because we don't know how they work, we don't know if they work. It makes it really difficult for researchers to actually test them. And so, I mean, going back to what you said, some of my own work has found that a lot of the reason that they might be effective is just a placebo effect, where people have big expectations of what they're able to do. And I think it makes sense, you're going to online dating because maybe you haven't had good luck choosing partners on your own in the past. So it can be really tempting to just surrender some of that decision making to an algorithm. But when you do that and you really believe that this algorithm knows who's right for you, I think that that helps you open yourself up to somebody who maybe you might not have considered before. And for that reason, I've shown people can be a lot more effective and successful in online dating when they buy into the idea that these things work. And also, I think they adjust their behaviors. So I found people disclose more, they share more about themselves, they do things that we know tend to make you more successful in relationships. So in that sense, it might not be so much that it was the compatibility that the platform identified. It's more your expectations and how those affected the way you behave towards somebody that ultimately led you into a relationship later.
Yeah. Yeah, you can tell after spending just a little bit of time on these dating apps that they really want you to feel good about what's happening. So you see the compatibility scores. You're a 93%. OK Cupid was famous for having these percentage matches, and you see that and you're like, it has this tendency to make you feel that there's someone out there for you if prior to that you were doubtful,
Yeah.
right? And so you see this in the algorithms. Are there what are some other examples of ways that the apps sort of cater to you, in the sense that they make it fun, make it interesting to you to stay involved in the process?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that dating apps have done differently from some of the more traditional sites. And it's something that's really helped them appeal to younger users, like college
Oh,
age students that I have are now, I mean, they're all on dating apps because they figured out how to gamify the process. So dating can feel like a lot of work. It can involve a lot of labor, but when you're able to make it fun for people, that helps keep them active and engaged. And so on a lot of these apps, you're swiping and then you're matching. And when you match, you win, like you've won the game.
hmm.
And so people want to have lots of wins, they want to accumulate lots of matches. And so I think that's helped to make the process a lot more engaging and a lot more fun. And it's allowed them to pick up a lot more new users.
Yeah.
And in doing that, I mean, all of these apps, they're using algorithms, even if they're not necessarily giving you a compatibility score. Like, in order to take all of those profiles and narrow them down and figure out who to show you, they have to have some way of doing that. So even if you're not seeing like a percentage score on somebody's profile, the app has somehow determined that of all the people on their platform, this is a person who would be good to recommend to you. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
random that you're seeing somebody's profile.
It's also, they're also very sneaky in the sense of what the app does after you've sort of initially sort of, let's just say, swipe left. So for those that aren't familiar with online dating, swipe right is the equivalent of I like this person. Swipe left is the equivalent of I'm not interested. But we all know that there are only so many profiles in a local area. And so for some people that go on to online dating, it can take, maybe even a week, and you're kind of already through a lot of the active profiles, depending on how big your city is. And I've had conversations with people who put filters up. I only want to be matched with somebody that's within 50 miles. And then they'll get served somebody and they'll start messaging them and they'll realize, they're halfway across the state. And I always tell them, it's like, yeah, they're not just going to say we're out of people at some point. They're not going to say there's nobody left within 50 miles. They're going to keep sort of, giving you options and, going beyond your filters. But you as the user, you might not realize that they're going to go beyond that limit, right?
Yeah. And what's interesting, I mean, in some of the research I've done, I've found that people will sometimes also adjust their search radius strategically, where it's like, okay, I feel like I've exhausted the options in my area, or I'm not liking what I'm seeing. So I'm going to look a little bit farther out from where I live. I'm going to increase the radius and see if I can expand my pool a little bit. And I did a study recently where I was interested in the success stories. So people who ended up in long-term relationships from online dating. So I was asking myself, like, who does this work for? I mean, you hear of all the burnout and all the negative experiences, like who is having good luck on these platforms?
Right.
And something I found is that a lot of the people who I interviewed for that study were in long distance relationships because they ended up finding a partner who lived in a different city, in a different state. One person met somebody in a different country, and they were able to get to know them because of the technology,
Well,
from a distance, and they ended up moving to be closer to that person eventually. And so it's really fascinating how people are able to overcome some of the limitations that used to exist related to distance because of online dating. I mean, 100 years ago, people were marrying people who lived in the same neighborhood as them, and now it's like you're able to meet somebody in a different state and have a relationship. I mean, when you think about it, it's just such a significant change from how things used to be before.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, so do you actually think that it's an effective strategy to, based on your work, I mean, would it make sense to say that it's an effective strategy to reconsider, long-term matches, or is that going too far?
I think it depends on what your goals are. So, with the people who I was interviewing for that study, these were people who ended up in serious long term relationships. And I think if that's your goal, then distance might matter less. It might be more about, okay, is this the right person for me? And not so much about where do they happen to live. I think if you are more casual, just looking to date around, see what's out there, you might not be willing to drive 3 hours to meet somebody, and it honestly might not be a good use of your time. So, I mean, I think it really depends, and it probably also depends on where you live and what the dating pool looks like in your area. If you're in a small town where you kind of know everybody already and the dating app is just showing you the same people who you encounter just going about your day-to-day routine, like that's a really different experience than if you live in a big city and you're going to naturally just be seeing new profiles all the time.
Okay, so let's get into the process of online dating. So let's talk about setting up your profile. So you finally you've debated for upwards of a year with your friends. You've been telling them you're going to set up your profile, and you finally get to the point where it is time to fill out those details. There's lots of, you've got pictures to consider, you've got content, you've got communicating your relationship goals. What would be some of the things that you start thinking about that are important when you're setting up that profile for the first time?
This is the fun part, and it's also just the overwhelming part of the whole experience. I mean, I think overall, the big thing to keep in mind is that you want to be honest in your profile, which, I think for most people, they're not going out there saying, okay, I'm going to intentionally mislead somebody. I think most people want to be honest, but sometimes when you're sitting there and you have the opportunity to choose your favorite picture of yourself and to write whatever you want to describe yourself, it can be easy to kind of oversell ourselves, to choose a photo that maybe like is an outlier in terms of not really looking like how we look today. And so when you do that, you might get a lot of matches and you're going to get a lot of first dates, but you might not get as many second dates because people might feel like you misled them, even if that wasn't necessarily your goal. So I
Yeah.
think it's important to be honest. In
Yeah, I've
terms,
seen, especially, it's fascinating because, having, messaged people and met up with them, you do see a lot of deception. I would say there's a lot more deception than you would expect going into it. And it's not even conscious deception necessarily. I mean, everyone has a year, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, where they liked how they looked then. And so that's what they want to represent on their profile. But, as you mentioned, like, what's the end game? Because you can't sustain that. Once you meet in person, you're going to be the person that you are, not the person that you self-presented online. It's kind of astounding that people are willing to sort of perhaps self-deceive in order to be happy with the whole process.
Absolutely. And like you said, I think a lot of people aren't even aware that they're doing it. Nicole Ellison at the University of Michigan had some really interesting research where she's looked at deception in online dating and found that a lot of this is because people just don't necessarily see themselves accurately. So it's not that they're trying to mislead people, it's that the image they're presenting to them, like it feels honest, like this is who they want to be and how they see themselves, and other people look at it and they're like, that's not who I was expecting to meet. And I think that this is actually a really big problem in online dating because it leads to people spending tons of time swiping, talking, matching, and then they're getting to the stage where they're going on first dates and nothing is happening beyond that, and they're just coming back to the apps. And so I mean, it's really, really important that you present yourself in a way that you're comfortable with, that presents the best version of you, the best side of yourself, but also that isn't one that is going to catch people by surprise when they actually meet you.
So I have sort of my pet tips that I give people for, sort of the images they put up, make them nice and clear, have at least one full body picture, have at least one picture doing an activity that you enjoy, maybe something with friends to kind of signal that you're sociable. Do you have any other thoughts about what you're trying to achieve in the picture portion of your profile?
Yeah, the picture portion is really the most important part, especially if you're using a dating app. Not necessarily because everybody just wants to know how physically attractive you are, but more that it's the first thing people are going to see and it's the biggest part of the profile. It's what people are mainly swiping on. So I think that you want pictures, like you said, that really clearly show what you look like and that would make you recognizable. Like when you did actually meet somebody, would they know what you looked like based on the picture? Would you have to describe what you were wearing, where you're sitting? Like you want a photo that's going to be true to reality. I think also pictures that support things that you say about yourself in your bio can be really helpful. Just kind of establishing your credibility that the way you're describing yourself is accurate. So, for example, if you say you're a big skier, that you're really great at it, that you've been doing it for a long time, like maybe show a picture of yourself doing that activity so people really can see that, okay, this person's describing themselves in a way that seems pretty accurate. And also just allowing your pictures to give people some context for what it would be like to actually meet you, hang out with you, maybe even be in a relationship with you. Like, what do you like to do? Where do you like to spend your time? So that context in photos can really help a lot. And when it comes to the friend pictures, it's tricky because you want to be social and you want people to see, the types of people you spend time with. And at the same time, you also want to make sure people know which one is you. And so being careful to show that, this is your friend group, but they would be able to easily recognize you in that picture. And also, I think sometimes people have a great photo of themselves with an X and they really want to use it. So they just chop that person out of the picture. Avoid doing that. Like people can tell when you've done something like that,
Yeah.
and it just raises
You
a
have
whole lot
one.
of
You can see
questions.
when you see that shoulder, when you see one of the shoulders up, that's the red flag that an
That's
X was cut out.
a huge red flag that you definitely want to avoid.
Um, so how about the content? You know, certain I've noticed that a lot of the apps are kind of limiting the text, which is it probably helps people with the stress of creating their profile if they know that they have to fit text within a certain character limit. Um, I know Hinge is very popular, at least amongst the my social group. They sort of give prompts, but what are your thoughts on good content?
So, in terms of the content, I mean, I think that this part it's also a part that people struggle with because it kind of feels like you're putting together a resume of, would you want to date me based on the information I'm putting out there? And so it can be kind of stressful to think about what you would
Yeah.
include in something like that. But the big thing you want to do here is tell people about yourself and also give them a sense of the kind of partner that you're looking for. I think that it can help if you're specific whenever possible. So, for instance, if you like to travel, that's really great to know about you. And at the same time, a lot of people in online dating like to travel. So, like, what are some unique qualities that you can also highlight that are going to really make you stand out? Something else that people do with the best profiles that I've seen is that they make it really easy for people to start a conversation with them. So I
Mm.
think sometimes like people read your profile, they'll be really interested and they don't really know what to say to you to get the conversation
Yeah.
going. So as an example, I'm, really into coffee. I consume a lot of caffeine. And so if I were setting up my profile, I might say something like, I'm always looking for the best coffee shop in Phoenix. So that way, if somebody wanted to start a conversation with me, they could give me a recommendation and that could be their opening line. And so you just make it really easy for people to engage with you when you include almost like a call to action in your profile so they know what they would need to say to start a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great piece of advice. And it also got me thinking about going back to the honesty piece and being authentic in your profile. Sometimes, like for example, you might want to say that you're very active in your profile or something like that, or post a picture of you, climbing a wall or something, doing some athletic activity. In other cases, you might have a picture of yourself traveling, but that honesty piece is important because, you don't want to present something that you're not, and in many different ways, because, I could think that my profile is better if I show how athletic I am, or I report that I exercise all the time. But that just means that I'm going to be matched with people that think that I'm an athlete, and that might cause some friction once we actually meet up and you start to get to know each other. And you also see it with so sometimes I'll come across female profiles, and they're, I would say a low percentage of them are women that are wearing their bathing suits, like a two-piece bathing suit. Mm-hmm. And part of me thinks, like, are you trying to signal to, like, really masculine guys to reach out to you? Because that's the impression I get as sort of a passive kind of guy. Like, I'm actually kind of intimidated by some of these profiles, and I always tell people that you catch what you bait for. Could you talk a little bit about certain signals that you might send off, and how you might have to be careful based on how you're constructing your profile?
Absolutely. And I think this is what's so hard about figuring out how to present yourself, because on the one hand, you're presenting who you are, and on the other hand, you're also trying to attract a certain type of person. And I think sometimes people know, I want to attract somebody really good looking, really athletic. So then they think, I also need to present myself that way if I want to attract that kind of person. And, you have to be careful doing that. So if you present an image of yourself as somebody really outdoorsy who likes to go hiking every weekend and hit the gym every day at 5 a.m., then you better be ready to do that when you do actually catch a partner. Bring somebody in who's going to expect that that is who you are, because that's what they want and that's what they do as well. So, I mean, you always have to be thinking about who is the type of person that this profile is going to attract, while at the same time making sure that you're still being true to yourself, because you could attract exactly what you're looking for. But if you're having to really misrepresent yourself in order to do that, like, I think you're setting yourself up for a situation where things aren't going to work out in the long run, because you're not going to want to have to be somebody you're not for someone every day. And so it's another situation where I think the honesty element becomes really, really important. And it might mean that you match less, but at least when you match, it's going to be with people who know who you are, and you know who they are, and you at least have like a good foundation moving forward.
Now, we've been talking about sort of principles that are probably equally applicable across men and women, but the online dating experience is fundamentally different for men versus women. And for the sake of this conversation, we'll stick to sort of heterosexual matching. It's very different in the sense that I would say the number one thing is probably the volume of incoming messages. That's probably one of the big things. Why don't we dive into these experiences and how they're different for men and women? We'll start with women. Could you just sort of paint a picture as to the the day-to-day, the week-to-week of online dating for women? What is that like to navigate?
Yeah, so when we're talking about heterosexual markets, there can be a really big gender imbalance on a lot of these platforms, where you've got a lot more men and far fewer women for them to match with. And so what that looks like for women is that they're often getting contacted a lot. They're getting a lot of attention. They're getting a lot of matches, a lot of messages. And I think when you first sign up, it can be a really great feeling to know that there's so many options there and so many people you might want to go on dates with. But give it a few weeks, a few months, and it all starts to get very overwhelming, where people are getting contacted a lot. And in some cases, they're getting more messages than they can handle or that they have time to respond to. And so they start to ghost and they start to flake and they start to not respond to people. And so you have a situation, and again, this can vary on the platform because platforms have different, user demographics and different gender ratios. But a lot of times it just means that women are getting a lot of messages and in some cases getting overwhelmed.
Yeah, and it clearly sort of underscores the importance for women to, in order to be successful, to maintain high standards. Like when you have that influx, if you don't have high standards, you are going to burn out. It's almost inevitable, I feel like.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it puts women in the situation where, I mean, sometimes the only thing you can really do is just not respond to people and to kind of ghost. And you've got a lot of options, which means that it might not be worth your time to talk to everybody. And so it creates a really interesting dynamic on some of these platforms. Like I said, I think some are worse with this than others. So it just depends.
Yeah. Okay, so let's sort of look at the experience for men, right? Uh, for men, they're now challenged with for most of the apps, they are going to be the first point of contact. They're going to be the first person to reach out. And now that we know that women tend to have these, the more people trying to get dates with them, it really makes it important to stand out for the men in that message. So do you have any tips for what men need to do in order to increase their chances of not being lost in the shuffle?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of men complain about not getting responses. So they're sending a lot of messages and they're not getting a lot of replies. And on
Yeah.
some of these platforms, like the response rates can sometimes be like 30%. Like 30% of your messages are actually getting replies, which
Oh, that would
can
be great. I wish it I wish it was 30%. I would
yeah,
have to say it's closer to 10.
and that's frustrating, right?
Yeah.
Like that, and it makes people wonder what they do need to do to stand out and to actually get people to start replying. And so people approach this differently. So sometimes people's response to that is to just send more messages. So they'll like come up with a great opener, they'll
Mm,
copy and paste it, and they'll just send it to everybody. So then they figure, okay, I'm not investing a lot of time because I know they're probably not going to respond. But it's actually like the opposite of what you want to do, because if somebody reads a message and it seems like you don't know who they are and like you didn't read their profile, that also doesn't give them much incentive to actually respond to it. I also hear of people just swiping right on everybody and
mhm.
thinking, okay, I'll just see who matches with me and who messages. And that's another example of doing something that is probably not going to be in your best interest in the long run, because then you're telling the algorithm that you're not very selective in who you swipe on.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I think that a better strategy is to spend time like reading somebody's profile, figuring out what it is about them that you find compelling, and then actually articulating that to the person. And I think when somebody sends you a message where it's clear that they're really interested and that they really took the time to read more about you, I think that that is more likely to get a response than something that looks like it's been copied and pasted to a lot of people, or even just a lot of people just say, hey, something very
Yeah.
generic that you would say to anybody. I mean, how is somebody supposed to respond to that, right? Um,
Yeah,
and so
I've
being
talked to
thoughtful.
a lot of females that I've spoken to have said that it's incredible how many howdies or hey and stuff like that, or hey beautiful, that they get, and I mean, to the point where women are putting on their profile, like, I hope you read, what are you looking for? Someone that actually reads this entire profile, type thing. Yeah.
Yeah, because when you do that, there's just no indication that you even know who you've sent this message to. And so when it seems like they didn't put in the time, I think it makes it also hard for somebody else to want to put time into a response. But it's common, like a lot of people do that. I also think for men who are using these platforms, who are encountering this and getting frustrated by like low response rates, I think it is helpful to know that it's not necessarily just you. Like, this is a phenomenon. It's something that happens in online dating. And also, again, I mean, different platforms have different ratios, men to women. So, like, if you're really having issues with this on one platform, I'd suggest trying something else and seeing if you have a different experience on
Yeah.
another app.
Yeah. I always tell people it's the statistical equivalent of attempting to win the lottery. I mean, you are navigating profiles, you're sending messages. At some point, it does become, in many cases, it does feel like work. I mean, I've been on the apps for about a decade, and yeah, sometimes it feels like work, and you really have to mentally prepare for the lows, for these moments where you feel like you're not getting anywhere. But in the back of your head, right, if you buy a lottery ticket and you don't win, you don't really get bummed out about it. But for some reason, if you send a message to someone on an online dating site and they don't reply back, you get kind of bent out of shape. And it's, to me, part of it is losing perspective on the sheer statistical unlikelihood that it's possible, but it's going to take time and patience before you actually connect with somebody.
Absolutely. And I think it's good for people to be aware of this, because also I think when people are trying online dating for the first time, they're really excited and they're really looking forward to being able to meet lots of new people, and they go into this process feeling very enthusiastic. But the reality, I mean, it's work and it takes time. And sometimes it takes months, it takes years. Like, people spend a lot of time cycling on and off of these platforms before they end up meeting somebody. And so knowing that that happens to people, I think, can also just help, I guess, set expectations for what the process could end up looking like.
Yeah. So, an interesting part of the online dating process relates to this the amount of self-disclosure that's going on. And it's fundamentally very different in online dating versus traditional dating. With traditional dating, you sort of have this natural cadence for building intimacy where you go on a date, you have some small talk, by date 3, you're talking about family. And at some point, you start getting into the bigger questions, right? Do you want to have children? Maybe some of your deeper political views, maybe even to the point of like talking about sexual preferences and stuff like that, like what you like in the bedroom, not orientation. But online dating makes it a little bizarre because you can signal some of this stuff in your profile. Like, you can put, you want to have kids, what are your political views, in your profile. And to me, it's very weird because a lot of these things are just sort of naturally meant to be discovered over time. Do you think that, like, this is having a net negative or maybe even a net positive effect on the process of getting to know someone?
This is an interesting question, because in a lot of ways, online dating flips the script from what we're used to, where it used to be that you would meet somebody and then you would start getting to know them, and there would be this process of disclosure and revealing yourself to that person. Whereas now you get to know a lot about them up front before you have maybe ever even had a conversation. So you just go in knowing a lot about someone. And sometimes this information is information that you wouldn't normally know until you'd been dating for maybe 6 months or a year. And so I would say like 10 years ago. I mean, when I first started studying online dating, I heard from people who would say that it was kind of uncomfortable knowing this much information about someone. And they didn't know, when you meet for the first time, are you supposed to bring it up? Or are you supposed to act like you don't know, even if it was in their profile? Like they didn't really know what to do with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
More recently, when I've done research looking at how people manage all of that information, I mean, they point to how it helps them reduce uncertainty and how it gives them something to talk about. So I think perhaps people have gotten more used to the idea of having access to profiles and knowing a lot about people just from being socialized through, social media and spending more time online, that maybe they've gotten more used to it. I've also had people tell me that having access to some of those deeper disclosures was helpful because it gave them answers to questions that they don't think they maybe ever would have been comfortable asking. And so the platform did the work for them by having that profile field for somebody to fill out. And so I've had people say, I asked questions or I had information that most people should have, but I don't know if I would have ever asked for it. And so I think it can be really helpful for people, but sometimes it is a little bit strange of a feeling where some really deep information about somebody and you haven't even decided if you want to reach out to them yet, but so much just from reading their profile.
Another weird thing about this that I tend to see in conversation is there's this risk of sort of, in your profile, just saying like, I want someone that is ready for children. I don't want a Trump supporter, right? These two sort of, things that either they're communicating in their profile or they're adamantly looking at in other profiles. If they see if they see conservative, for example, it's an immediate swipe left. And what's bizarre to me is I feel like this is sort of a dangerous game that you're playing, because I would argue that if you were just randomly meeting people and getting to know them, that you wouldn't swipe left on somebody that labeled themselves unconservative if you met them in person. You'd chat with them, you get to know them, you like them, and then later on you find out that they, tick the Republican box, for example. And in traditional relationships, like, there are more options because you're not immediately putting up that X and you're not ignoring people because they tick that political box that you disagree with. I don't know if you feel the same way, if they're sort of limiting the number of options because they're so adamant about reading into the details and the preferences of the other person.
Yeah, and I agree that you have to be careful with that because sometimes also, I mean, when these platforms set up profiles, sometimes they actually give you specific prompts that they want you to address, and they kind of tell you what sorts of information to share about yourself. And so I think we assume that because they're asking, that must be information that's important for evaluating somebody. And I don't think that's always the case, because at the end of the day, these platforms, they're search and recommendation engines. And so in the sense that they can put you into categories, it makes it easier for them to show profiles to you and to figure out who to recommend. But people are complex. And when you meet somebody just out there in day-to-day life, I mean, normally you're getting a sense of them through having a conversation, and you're getting a sense of like, do they make me laugh? Are they nice? How are they treating the waiter at the restaurant that we're at? Like, you look at things like that, and that's information that you're not probably going to get from a profile. And so sometimes I think having that information can encourage people to prioritize things that maybe don't matter as much as they actually think that they do. Absolutely.
Yeah, I remembered a story specifically related to politics. I was on a first date, and but we had been, messaging for, a couple weeks. And so theoretically she got to know me. And then, in the middle of the date, she's like, well, you didn't vote for Trump, did you? Now, full disclosure, did not vote for Trump. But But it was shocking to me that rather than add up the incremental information that she got about my character and my preferences and the way I interact with people and what I believe, that she put it implied that she was putting a ton of weight into that one question in person.
Mhm.
And it shocked me, and it made me think that, that part of the reason why some people might struggle is by sort of overweighing these like yes or no type things.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, part of it is just, I mean, when I've talked to people who have ended up in long-term relationships from these platforms, one question that I like to ask is how they knew they were compatible with their partner. Like, what was the information that helped
Mm-hmm.
you make that determination? And people aren't pointing to things like that. Like, they're talking about how that person supports them, how they show up for them. Like, they're talking about more qualities that you wouldn't really know about somebody without having a conversation with them. They're not necessarily talking about, the types of information like what you're describing that people might pull up of a profile. And so again, like, I think it's really important to consider what you're looking for, and also what is really going to matter to you in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
And what things you can live with and what things are truly deal breakers.
Yeah. Uh, so let's talk about the transition process from the chatting via typically online dating is a certain amount of messaging that goes back and forth, but of course at some point it has to lead to an in-person date. I have talked with a lot of women about this recently, and I keep hearing about this trend that a lot of men are willing to engage in these messaging processes, and then they're very reluctant to actually make the dating plans. Like they message too long, to the point where women are like actually putting in their profile like, I'm not looking for a pen pal. Now I've encountered both scenarios where some women want to message a little bit longer, some just want to meet up and sort of get that in-person date out of the way. But could you talk a little bit about the things that you might want to keep in mind as you're transitioning from the online get to know you phase to the in-person phase?
Yeah, and I think there could be a couple of things that are contributing to what you're describing, where people are chatting and they're not really active about taking it to the next level and actually meeting somebody. I mean, I think that one thing that could be contributing to that is that it's a little harder to gauge interest when you're just talking to somebody through text. So in person, you can kind of get a sense when you're having a conversation if somebody's into you, if they're, maybe interested in seeing you again. Like, you look at their nonverbals. When you make a joke, you look to see if they laughed. Like, you pick up on those things. Online, it's more difficult. Like, you make a joke and they say LOL, but you don't know if that joke landed. Like, it can take longer to figure out if they're actually interested in you. And I think that people are afraid of rejection and afraid of putting themselves out there. And they don't really want to ask somebody out on a date if that person's not ready to actually agree to meet up with them. So I
Mhm.
think that could be part of it. I think another part of it could also be that they're potentially just ambivalent about meeting. And I think that people have different thresholds for what it will take for them to meet somebody offline. And for some people, they're okay to swipe and meet up with somebody that same day. But for others, they really want to take the time to get to know somebody so they feel safe, or they feel like it's worth them driving across town to meet this person. And so for some people, this can be like a pretty big milestone. And there's a lot of people who never actually meet somebody from online dating. Like, they're matching and they're talking to people, but they're not necessarily going on a lot of dates. And so I think it could also be that some people just they're not necessarily as eager to meet face to face unless they're pretty sure that they like the person. And so for that reason, it could be taking a little longer. Now, that
Yeah,
being
yeah.
yeah, I wouldn't
Go
recommend
ahead.
that approach, like the pen pal approach. I mean, it's not necessarily a good strategy, but I do think it's something that happens a lot in online dating.
Well, and you also have, I mean, you have a wide variety of mate values in online dating. And, one of the thoughts that I had around that is that, I mean, if you look at the population of men, there are, you know, not to sugarcoat it at all, there are a lot of what you might consider ineffectual males that have exceedingly low experience in intimacy with women, and it's a lot easier to set up a profile and click and read and send a text than it is to approach someone in a bar or a restaurant. So you get a selective sample in terms of the people that are reaching out, and maybe that's also contributing to the the extended messaging back and forth. I'm not sure. That's just sort of speculation.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think there could be a selection effect happening here too, where if you are a person who's really afraid of rejection, it makes sense that you would be on a dating app in the first place, because when you match with
Hmm.
somebody and you start messaging, you already know that person's interested. So you're not really having to put yourself out there the same way that you would if you were to approach somebody in person. So if you're ending up with a lot of people that are really afraid of rejection, what does that look like when you're messaging? It could look like somebody just really waiting a long time and wanting to be absolutely sure this person's interested before they're willing to ask them out.
So to cap our conversation, I know that a lot of your work sort of focused on these like indicators of long-term success. So you've done work with couples that were married and met through online dating. Do you have any closing thoughts about what you've learned about what what leads to success in online dating?
Yeah, so I've studied online dating through all of its various stages, from when people are setting up profiles to when they're matching, meeting for first dates, all the way through marriage when they actually end up in long-term relationships. And something that I've observed is that when people are swiping, the things that they swipe on are not always the things that make them successful in the long run. So, for example, one thing I hear about a lot is like a height requirement where, people go on to a dating app and they're unwilling to date somebody outside of a certain range in terms of height, to the point where people feel like they have to put this information in their profiles because they know that somebody's going to ask them. And that information, like when I talk to people who are in long-term committed relationships, like they're not telling me that the reason they chose their partner was because of how tall they were, or even some of the other things that people emphasize in profiles, like how much money somebody makes, or where they went to school, or what they do for a living. Like those aren't the things that people bring up. So when I ask them, like, how did you know you were compatible with your partner? They talk about the intangible qualities of that other person, things they bring to the relationship. Like they talk about how supportive they are. They talk about how they make them feel valued. They talk about these qualities that I often don't hear people bring up when they tell me how they're choosing partners based on profiles. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that some of the information that you're getting early on, like it might not necessarily be what ends up mattering to you in the long run. And part of it's also those things take time to gauge, but opening yourself up to meeting different types of people, maybe people who don't necessarily fit with your wish list, because sometimes it's those individuals that you end up really hitting it off with.
Well, if you've never signed up for an online dating profile and you've been contemplating, I hope this conversation pushes you over the edge. There's always a million reasons not to sign up. You're not ready, you're too busy, but I consider my experiences through online dating all worth it. I've had multiple long-term relationships through it, so hopefully this will inspire some folks to jump into the cold water and give it a try. Thank you so much for being on today, Liesel Sharabi.
Thanks so much.
For more on Liesel, visit her blog on psychologytoday.com entitled Dating in the Digital Age. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with 2 of your friends. Follow the Why Do We Do That Facebook page for updates and additional content. Don't forget to rate and write a review on Apple Podcasts. Follow on Instagram at Why Do We Do That Podcast or Twitter at WDWDTpod. As always, feel free to email me with comments or guest suggestions at whydowethatpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?